Welcome to this international conference in digital format from takers to shapers, challenges for regions in a dynamic EU polity. I'm very happy that we have a lot of registrations. Not everybody is yet in the conference room. And of course, as it is with digital conferences, some people join us only for parts of the conference. But I'm very happy that this conference is possible because it was planned for quite a long time together with the co-organizers here. And of course, I want to welcome all of you very warmly. And of course, I would like to say thank you to the cooperation partners, because that is the Regiopal project. Sarah Meyer and Sarah Kikic are here, and they will welcome you in a minute themselves. And the second cooperation partner is the Arbeitskreis Europäische Integration, which is an association, scientific association for research from different disciplines on European integration. And this is also a co-organizer, and its conference is funded by the Commission Erasmus program, and I'm very happy that this was possible. And then it's in cooperation with Civis, which many of you don't know, but Civis is a network of European civic universities. University of Tübingen is part of that. It's 7 or 8 different European universities from different parts in Europe, who then joined a network of universities as part of the project of building a European university area, a higher education area. So I'm happy that we have the different organizers and cooperation partners here on board. And of course, I would like to say thank you to my research assistant, Tim Bausenhardt, who has supported the preparation of the conference in the last couple of weeks and months. And of course, that was very, very helpful to have Tim here. And all of you have been in touch with Tim, because he was, one of the things he did was the registration. So thank you very much, Tim. Let me just, before I hand over then to Sarah, say a few words about the background of the conference. What we do see since the 1990s, really, a discussion about Europe of the regions. That was a claim, a vision, a light build raised by not all regions in Europe, but a number of regions, and who wanted to play a stronger role in European integration in the EU multi-level polity, because they had the experience that they were losing competencies here as a result of European integration, so that their national competencies were actually hollowed out by that. And some of the initiatives and outcomes of this discussion is certainly the Committee of the Regions as a body among the Brussels institutions, a consultative body, not a formal institution, but a consultative body, which advises the European institutions on all kinds of regional affairs. It is part of the legislative process, but just with a consultative voice, not with a decision-making voice. So that's certainly part of that. In addition to that, we have seen a range of lobbying activities, of subnational activism at European level. With a tremendous amount of representatives being set up in Brussels by European regions. And we have seen theoretical interpretations of that, the multi-level governance approach coming from the academic background, but which then really became also the political idea, particularly taken up by the Committee of the Regions here in metaphors like governing in partnership, giving regions a stronger voice in European affairs. And there have been challenges for regions in different respects, certainly at national level, but also at European level. Regions have responded to that, as I said, in manifold ways. And what we continuously see, that at least a number of regions want more influence, want more impact at national level and at EU level in terms of deciding, having a voice on issues that affect the regions. We do that, see that currently in relation to the economic recovery plan, certainly where regions want to be more strongly involved. And we do see that with regard to the so-called Conference on the Future of Europe. This is, as many of you know, or probably know already about the conference, something that started in 2019, announced by incoming Commission President von der Leyen. It was announced to be a 2-year deliberative endeavor involving citizens. So a different attempt than what was taken in previous rounds of discussion about Europe, which was more elite focused, but now it should be citizens who should have a voice here. As an outcome of the pandemic, it didn't start last year as originally planned, but it is now going to start next Sunday on Europe Day, May 9th. So, and again, in this conference, we see that regions try to have a voice. The Committee of the Regions try to have a voice. So certainly it's a very up-to-date conference in terms of when we were planning this, it wasn't that obvious that this conference is certainly an opportunity for regions, for citizens at regional level to get involved into these activities. And so the Conference on the Future of Europe would certainly be an issue that will guide us through the conference, and an issue which we will take up lots of times, right? So this is certainly an important focus here of that conference. But we will address the issue of regions and how they shape the EU polity. We will take that up in different in relation to different topics and ideas. Today it's more constitution making, but tomorrow it's more of a focus on networking of regions, but also issues of regional identity. So this is like the overall idea here of the conference, and to discuss these challenges. And I'm very happy that we were able in the sessions and in the audience to bring together people from different European countries, and certainly from different backgrounds, not only university people, not only students. That is, of course, very important, but that we also have a number of what we would call practitioners, people working in these institutions, in the Committee of the Regions, in other EU bodies, in German Landtag or other EU-related institutions, so that we bring together practitioners together with people who have the academic perspective on these developments here. And I think that's always quite important and quite fruitful to bring these together. So I leave it like that for my intro remarks, and would like to hand over now to Sarah Meyer from the Regiopal project. Please, Sarah.
Yes, thank you very much, Gabriele, and also a very warm welcome from my side on behalf of the research project RegioPal, and of course also the Department of European Policy and the Study of Democracy at Danube University Krems, where our project is carried out in cooperation with our various partners. RegioPal is an international multi-annual research project where we study the role of regions, or more specifically, we study the role of regional parliaments in EU multi-level governance. And we also actively engage with regional level political actors to contribute to the ongoing EU future debate from a regional perspective, which we find very important. And as Gabriele Abels already mentioned, it is really timely, this conference regarding the relation to the Conference on the Future of Europe. And fortunately to us, Gabriele Abels is part of our larger research network within the framework of this RegioPal project. And I would also like to thank you, Gabriele, of course, for organizing this conference and for inviting us to cooperate with you in that. And yes, thanks to you as well. So very, very briefly, I think really there is no better time to talk about regions' involvement in the EU with the Conference on the Future of Europe to start this Sunday, as Gabriele Abels mentioned. And I really very much look forward to the inputs and discussions that we're going to have today and also tomorrow on the role of regions in EU constitution making, which is going to be the first session, then also on the place of regional parliaments within or for or within EU decision making. And then finally, of course, also the many facets of facets and faces of regional identity in Europe and the relations regional identity has in the context of regions in the EU. And of course, I also hope that you will find the time to participate also in our dialogical art project, the Outer Space Transmitter, that you will also find on the program, and that my colleague from the RegioPal project, Sarah Kikic, will now introduce to you. And I would just like to thank all of you for your interest and participation in the conference, and I very much look forward to our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you also to Dr. Abels and Sarah Meyer for the introduction and the possibility to present our project in this framework. As said, my name is Sarah Kikic. Within the research project RegioPal, I am responsible for all things related to arts and culture. And RegioPal is not only contributing to this conference in an academic sense as a cooperation partner and by presenting different papers, but also in a rather different framework. And that is why I'm talking to you right now. What do I mean by that? As a background, as Sarah Meyer mentioned, RegioPal is a participatory research project. That means we actively engage with political actors at regional level in workshops about the EU future debate. And as Gabriele Abels already mentioned, this Sunday, the EU-wide conference on the future of Europe will start. And especially against this background, RegioPal not only puts a great emphasis on this dialogue between politics and the social sciences, but also on discussing this with citizens about Europe. In this context, we were considering how we can approach the debate on Europe in an innovative and accessible way. So how can we get this debate to the citizens in their respective regions, meeting them in their everyday realities, inviting them to share their personal perspectives on Europe? To create this possibility to engage in this very personal experience about Europe, we decided for an artistic approach, art as a medium to initiate this dialogue with citizens. For this reason, we started in cooperation with the artist Mona Schulzek, the dialogical artwork Outer Space Transmitter. So now, basically, I turn to you. During this two-day conference, you are all invited and have the possibility to be part of this artistic experience. How does it work? The Outer Space Transmitter is an installation which is a fully functional antenna through which messages can be sent into outer space. As an impulse, the question is asked what it means to be a citizen of the EU. And from these answers, you you can give. The artist Mona Schulzek creates art images which will be sent into space via this antenna she constructed. As said, you have now the possibility to send your thoughts about Europe into space. To do so, you go to the website outerspacetransmitter.art and enter your message. Right after, Mona creates a text image by translating it into a unique character set created by her. And there, this is this dialogical process between you as the participant and the artist. Individual art images are created, which will be sent as radio waves into space, and at the same time also published on the website's digital archive. For a deep dive on the project and the cooperation with Regiopal, there will be a session today at 4:30 p.m. So you are invited to join us there to talk a bit about an artistic dialogue. And for now, we want to show you a short animation clip of the project. We would be happy about your participation, and Mona awaits your messages. I hope that this animation had made you a little bit curious about the project, and we are looking forward for your messages and thoughts about Europe. The link to the website, I've already seen it, is also posted in the chat. So have a look about the project and join us. And for now, I thank you for your attention, and I wish you interesting sessions and a fruitful debate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. And yes, I hope very much too that people get a little bit curious, and that this also makes them curious for what we will do and what they can expect for the next 2 days for the conference. So, and without further ado, I would like to invite the rest of the presenters for the first session, the discussions, first session, Regents as Actors in EU Constitution Making, that you go online too, that you turn on your video so that we can see everybody here for the first session. And I just hand over to first session facilitator, Dr. Elisabeth Donath from the Danube University Krems, who's also a member of the Regiopal project team. So up to you now, Elisabeth, to chair our session. And people who are not members of the panel, please leave your video off. But can I ask, like, also Annalena to join us, and and Sarah too. Well, no, Sarah, you're not, but Frau Kapritz, you can join us as well, and then we have everybody here. Yes, 7 people. That's right number that we need for this session. Elisabeth, please.
Thank you very much, Gabi. Also, a very warm welcome from my side to today's first session, which is titled Regions as Actors in EU Constitution Making. And this session is going to consist of 4 presentations, so to say. I will keep myself quite short so that we can really focus on presentations and discussions, but my impression was that 2 of the contributions are focusing more at the status quo and or looking into historical developments, and the other 2 address very much also future developments and perspectives on this issue. But of course this division is somehow artificial, since I think every contribution will look into the past and into the future as well, of course. I would like to welcome our speakers, but also our 2 discussants. The discussants to this session will be Professor Dr. Francesco Palermo from University of Verona and Eurach-Bozen. And second discussant will be Wolfgang Peters, Deputy Director of the Communication Department at the European Committee of Regents. Thank you very much for acting as discussants in this session. Since this is obviously the first session in this conference, I just going to remind some rules of procedure we are going to have. So it is planned to have the 4 presentations in consecutive order. Each presentation will have a maximum of 15 minutes. Please stick to time. I will have a focus on this. To the audience, you can already post questions in the chat if you like to. And brief questions of understanding might be answered immediately after a talk, but the discussion will take place at the very end of the session. After the presentation, our 2 discussants will comment the papers for us. They have about 10 minutes for their comments. And we will finish the session with a broad discussion among all, including also comments and questions from the audience, of course, but also discussions among the panelists and discussants and so on. So this is how we are going to proceed. Feel free to post already questions into the chat. And I think we can go ahead with the first presentation. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Beniamino Caravaggio di Torito from La Sapienza University in Rome. He is Professor of Public Law in the Faculty of Political Science, Sociology and Communications at the University of Rome, La Sapienza. And Professor Caravita is going to talk about European constitutionalism and the role of regions to us. Professor Caravita, please go ahead.
So, thank you. I thank you, all the organizer and the participants to this really interesting conference that falls in a period very particular, because we are at the end, we hope, at the end of the pandemic crisis, but we are also at the beginning, at the new beginning of the Convention on the Future of Europe. So the contribution that can be given in this conference, like in other conferences, could be part of an important discussion about the future of Europe. I will start from some 20, 30, 40 years ago, as maybe when maybe most of the participants to this conference were not active, were just very young. But myself, unfortunately or fortunately, I was already on the inside the discussion I will present here. At the end of the 20th century, the European nation states seemed to have reached the end of the lifespan. And in the conviction of the irreversibility of the European construction, the European nation states found no one more regretting them. After all, they have been responsible for the two greatest tragedies of our contemporary history, colonialism and the two great wars, both of them with the same origin, the European nationalism. In the last 2 decades of the 20th century, there was a great flourishing of initiatives grounded on principle of regionalization and growth of territorial autonomy. In France, the creation of the regions dates back to the 80s. In Spain, the phenomenon of autonomy was strengthening. In Poland, immediately after the fall of communists, the traditional voivodeship were revitalized and strengthened. In Belgium, the 1993 constitution marks the definitive transition to a federal model. In Great Britain, there was a significant strengthening of the Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish parliaments, and there was the creation of regions in England. In Italy, in the time I was telling, we experienced the political phenomena that led to the strengthening of regions also with the old constitution, with the Constitution of 48. There were the Bassanini laws, then to the constitution, then to two constitutional laws, 1991, with the direct election of the president of the regions, and finally with the constitutional law number 3 of 2001, which increased regional powers to a far greater degree. We are talking about the years of the rise of the role of the Committee of Regions within the European institutional framework, which, however, will find no place among the European institutions in the Lisbon Treaty. In addition, this trend was fostered by the regions, by the Conference of Regions with legislative powers, by the Euro regions, which sometimes seem to challenge the nation states on sectoral policies. Think about fishing policies or sea protection policies or trans-European transport policies. We are talking about the years of the legendary 4 engines of Europe. I don't know if someone of you remember it, which brought together Lombardy, Rhône-Alpes, Baden-Württemberg, and Catalonia, a great territorial lobby, an instrument of Europe's richest regions to seek direct dialogue with the EU institution, bypassing or overriding the states. The deep meaning of this process in the early 90s was that the concept of the state itself faced the occurrence of two processes of structural change: European integration from one side, regionalization from the other side. Both processes seem to undermine the authority, the competencies, and the role of the nation state. More importantly, the European Union began to involve the regions into its decision-making processes, while the regions started to emphasize the need for access to European institutions to promote territorial interests. The final result was a new concept that dominated the field of territorial policy through the 90s, that of an Europe of the regions. However, the interpretation of the concept among scholars differs significantly from what was sought by sub-state units or sub-state political parties. Scholars argued that regional participation in European affairs represented the third level of decision-making and used this concept to address intergovernmental and neo-functional approaches to European integration. Meanwhile, political parties at the regional level understood the concept of Europe of regions not as a uniform theory or model of regional engagement in Europe, but as a political constitutional or economic objective that enabled the realization of their specific territorial interests. So the normal different way of scholars and politicians. European integration was therefore intended to open up a new possibility of pursuing territorial interests that were once strongly limited by the expansion of nation state, and regions were able to pursue and then acquire a new political role, not least due to the federalization and regionalization of states. In that period, regional organizations have strengthened their image in the EU. The classical example of this attitude was the continuous creation of regional lobbies in Brussels, the regional engagement in European network, and the practice of the so-called paradiplomacy. The creation of the Committee Region was supposed to provide a political arena to voice regional demands. And I would say all these institutional phenomena were viewed, if not favorably, at least benevolently by the European Constitution, which found in them an important extra-state reference. In fact, several documents of the European institution, such as the White Paper on European Governance and Communication 2002 and 2003, went in this direction. The desire enlightened by that communication was to promote the role of regional and local stakeholders in determining the decision making. In the paper, I quote some word of the Commission about the meaning of strengthening this dialogue, which was to seek to allow the Commission to sound out their views, in the meaning of the regions, on those political community policies which they help to implement and which have an impact on regional and local level before the formal decision-making process gets started. The European Parliament went further. In 2003, the European Parliament stressed that the role of the territorial entities was more important where such entities were granted the legislative competencies, making a further path. This point we can some way find inside Article 4, Paragraph 2 of the Treaty on European Union that takes in account this point. But and I just quote the subsequent Article 5, Paragraph 3, which lays down the principle of subsidiarity. But the interpretation of the Lisbon Treaty is not uniform, cannot be seen only in the attempt of strengthening the role of the regions and the local authorities. Because on one side, the Lisbon Treaty included the regions and the decentralized entities in the governance of the European Union, especially strengthening the principle of subsidiarity through a new and more inclusive control mechanism. On the other side, the treaty granted and boosted the role of the European Council, which remains the international forum of the master of treaties, and which gains the constitutional role of the political engine of the Union. In addition, the praxis of the European Council has proven to be decisive over critical paths and decisions undertaken during the decades of crisis, as well during the pandemic. It has shown substantially the role and the relevance of the masters in the mean of the states in the European constitutional framework. Here, the balance of power after Lisbon shows, according to my opinion, shows that the European federalizing process can go further only if the old states remain the pivot of the process. The old idea or chimera of the Europe of regions, of an Europe of region, have to be reconsidered, has been marginalized, if not abandoned. We have also to consider the centralizing impact on the structure of the European Union of the economic and financial crisis, which has left a further mark of on the regions. Let me see the time. So, I think you told me 15 minutes, no, if I don't mistake.
About 3 minutes left.
Yeah. I was controlling that. So I am forced to make some very quick passage. Another point that can be discussed, and I try to discuss in the paper, and I quote just the things I wrote, is the problem of federalization, of the separatism and of the secession. We were facing the dramatic situation of Catalonia with the political, military, social, and economic consequences. I think we had a misunderstanding of the principle that directing European Union and the vicenda in the history of Catalonia. I go to the end of my presentation. If we believe to the construction of Europe, we have to choose if we have to follow the path of these years. I believe that the process, the federalizing process of Europe can go further only if the states remain the pivot of the process. Under the control of the Court of Justice, with the as large as possible participation of regions and of local authorities, with the as large as possible participation of citizens, of people. But I think that if we believe in the future of Europe, we have to accept that the states remain, the old nation states remain the master of this process. the time of in Europe of regions, or is the other side of an Europe of judges, are finished, at my opinion. The politics must recover its role. We have to recover the primauté of the politics. We have to accept that politics and no more interests, no more representation of interest will decide the destiny of Europe. We have an occasion in front of us. It's the occasion of the Convention of Europe, of the future of Europe. And that is the seat in which we can introduce proposal. That is the seat in which we can discuss how can politics recover its role. And I think we have to focus on this point, because otherwise we risk that the European process will dissolve. I just make I just put three suggestions, three institutional suggestions on this point. And as you will see, there are no suggestion on the role of regions. The three suggestions are the election of the European Parliament have to involve European parties according common rule of presentation of candidatures and lists to be presented on European basis. The seats of the President of the Commission, President of the Council, of the European Council, have to be unified, and it is possible under the treaty in force, in such a way we can bring together the political and the executive engine of the Union under the control of Parliament. We have to enhance the legislative initiative of members of Parliament, so to reconnect political representation and constituencies. Let me say, I seem to be very drastic. Personally, I had experiences. I know personally the experiences of the four engines of Europe, because I participated in it with the region Lombardy. But I think I finish. I think that we have to rediscover the role of the politics inside the Union if we want to foster the federalizing process, the European federalizing process. Okay, thank you, and sorry for the some minutes more I took. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Caravita. I think you've already addressed some major questions which will be very fruitful throughout the whole conference. But I'd like to hand over to our next speaker. There are no questions up to now into the chat, but I said we are going to have the discussion at the very end of this session. Just the chat is just if you already want to post some questions, if you have something in mind that really has to be addressed right now. But I will hand over to Annalena Högenauer, which is going to be our next presenter. She's assistant professor and senior researcher at the Department of Social Sciences and deputy head of the Institute of Political Science at the University of Luxembourg. And Annalena Högenauer's presentation is going to be about Look Back in Anger, Regional Involvement and Treaty Changes since 1990. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. Let me just quickly share my PowerPoint presentation. Now, as you can see, I have changed the title slightly because I think anger is a strong word. So that's more something that the practitioners have to decide whether they are angry or not. But I think, so based on my experience, my research into regions and their possibilities or how they use the different European channels, I have looked at the question on whether this is disappointing the developments of the last 30 years. So I will be looking briefly at the treaty changes over time, and then also look at a little bit assess the way that regions have reacted to those treaty changes in practice. So my presentation in that sense follows very nicely the presentation by Professor Caravita, in that indeed this is linked to the different changes in regional mobilization and regional powers since the 1980s and 1990s. And largely the late 1980s are kind of seen as a period where regions really started to mobilize, more and more regions started to mobilize, move offices to Brussels, demand participation rights in Europe, which then led to some important treaty changes that really brought the regions into EU policymaking. And of course, one of the most important treaties in that respect was the Treaty of Maastricht, where the principle of subsidiarity was really emphasized, and regions for the first time were officially represented within the European institutions through the Committee of the Regions. So symbolically, this was a very important point of official recognition. But of course, after this, there was also a period quickly of disenchantment, especially by the stronger European regions like the German Länder, so the regions of the federal states, were not that impressed subsequently. And basically what this triggered is a shift also academically from talk about the regions, the Europe of the regions, to questions about whether Europe of the regions was feasible, whether it could be reached and how it could be reached. And one of the stumbling blocks that very quickly emerged was this question on how much influence should regions have? So how much influence should we give them? And the problem here is that they are so very different. We have very, very large regions of 17 million inhabitants. We have tiny regions. We have regions that are extremely wealthy, regions that are relatively poor, and we have states that don't have regions, like Luxembourg. So we have a very diverse picture here, and that of course makes it difficult to define, from the European perspective, to really define a way in which to involve regions that would correspond to the powers and the status of every single region in Europe. And my research personally has focused on the stronger regions, so Belgium, Austria, Germany, the United Kingdom, and so on. And from this perspective, I think there was a feeling that the regions risk losing out over time, and especially as more and more competences move to the European level, that ultimately the regional level in a way is losing out and is becoming weaker. And this has also led some of my colleagues like Charlie Jeffrey from the University of Edinburgh to argue that in fact strong regions increasingly try to disentangle competences. So that they also, in the context of the Lisbon Treaty, for example, really pushed for a clearer definition of competences, of European competences, national competences, or also regional competences, to avoid this shift, this creeping shift of competences to the European level during the in between treaties. So let me briefly talk about how the powers of the regions have evolved on the European level and to what extent these opportunities were used. And as I mentioned, one of the most important, so I will not talk about every single change, but I'll highlight the important ones. And I think the key moment is certainly the creation of the Committee of the Regions in the Treaty of Maastricht, which is a consultative organ, so it can provide, of course, opinions on proposed legislation from the European Union. In some policy areas, the consultation of the Committee of the Regions is mandatory, and the people who sit on the Committee of the Regions nowadays are all elected regional and local representatives. So this is important, as I said, symbolically, because it provided an institutional or institutionalized regular way for regions and also local authorities to communicate with the European level. However, there were also some, as I said, some disappointments, because of course, the majority of representatives on this committee come from the weaker regions or local authorities, in light of the fact that most of the member states in the European Union are not federal states, but rather more centralized states. And in the initial years, there was also some debate about quantity versus quality. So the the Committee of the Regions was very active. It issued a lot of opinions, also opinions in areas where the consultation was not mandatory. But then sometimes these opinions were not seen as necessarily bringing new ideas to the table or not having a lot of influence. So over time, actually also academics identified a change in strategy, that the Committee of the Regions actually started to issue fewer opinions, but then more targeted and with more forceful positions. Another very important change was, of course, that in the Council of Ministers, regional representatives could now also sit, and especially, of course, in the case of federal member states or quasi-federal member states. So basically the clause in the treaty states that it has to be a representative at the ministerial level, but that can be the regional ministry. It doesn't have to be a national ministry. But there is a constraint, and that is that even a regional representative has to be able to commit the government of that member state. So in other words, Bavaria can represent Germany, but it has to speak for Germany. It cannot present a Bavarian position. So that's, of course, a limiting factor, but nevertheless, it represents, of course, symbolically the possibility of stronger regions to engage more centrally in EU policymaking. And often that has an impact on who then sits also in the preparatory committees of the Council, and also who later goes to the committees of the European Commission when it comes to the implementing of policies. Then in the Treaty of Lisbon, we have a few further changes. For example, the Committee of the Regions obtained the right to bring action before the European Court of Justice, to have the legality of European acts reviewed. This was a very important change, because before this, the Committee of the Regions could not enforce, or it could not bring complaints to the European Court of Justice if it felt that the principle of subsidiarity was not respected, for example. So now, after the Treaty of Lisbon, it has that power, and that, of course, also enhanced its status. Then the respect for regional and local self-government was included in the treaty as a principle, and the competences were more clearly defined in the Treaty of the European Union as well. And last but not least, the Commission has to now explicitly assess the impact of its measures on the regional and local level, both financially and in terms of what kind of legislative changes might be necessary to implement its measures. And also related to subsidiarity, of course, we have the new early warning system. So where it's a system that's a new mechanism that is primarily addressed to national parliaments, and where national parliaments can do a subsidiarity control before the Council and the European Parliament vote on legislative proposals. But regional parliaments can also participate in it. And especially the regional parliaments that have legislative powers. Now, it depends on the national rules. Each member state defines how its regions can participate in this mechanism. But essentially, the idea is that they should forward their opinions to the national parliament, and the national parliament should take them into account in deciding whether or not to criticize the proposal on grounds of a breach of subsidiarity. Now, there are some limitations to this in practice, and this is indeed that regions only have about 4 to 6 weeks, regional parliaments, to define their position, because afterwards the national parliament still has to be able to adopt its own position, and this whole process cannot take more than 8 weeks. In addition, the resources of regional parliaments are quite limited from my experience. So looking into regional parliaments, there are relatively few EU experts employed by regional parliaments. Their committees tend to be much smaller than the committees of national parliaments, and they tend to meet not so frequently. So adopting a reasoned opinion within 4 to 6 weeks is quite a challenge for a regional parliament. Then they might not be so motivated to participate, because this is simply a subsidiarity check. So technically they can't really make substantive proposals as part of the system. And it's of course only a consultative mechanism. Ultimately, the Commission is not obliged to take into account the recent opinions that it receives, even if there is a yellow card or an orange card. So even if a third of the national parliaments or more object on grounds of subsidiarity, ultimately, the Commission is not obliged to actually take this into account, and it can maintain its legislative proposal. So that makes the system somewhat unattractive. And again, the principle of subsidiarity is still not that clearly defined. Now, there were a few of the demands of the regions that were not accepted in the end. So, for example, the open method of coordination that some regions wanted to abolish because they saw this as a way to expand European competences secretly was not abolished. It's still in the Treaty of Lisbon. And also the Council can move from unanimity to qualified majority voting without a treaty change necessarily. So without this whole treaty change procedure. Now, in my research, I've looked a little bit, as I said, on how regions have responded to this, to see whether they are actually happy with these changes in practice. And I analyzed, for example, an 11-year period of reasoned opinions issued by some regions from Germany, Austria, Belgium, and the UK from 2007 to 2017. Now, this is not entirely complete, this research, because the reasoned opinions that I looked at were those that were uploaded on RegPacks, and not all regional parliaments participate in this. And it's not clear whether they all always upload their opinions, but it still provides us with a reasonably good overview of how actively this mechanism is used. And some of the things that I've noticed are, first of all, the powers of regional parliaments differ very greatly between member states. So, for example, the German regional parliaments are comparatively weak in the sense that Germany deems that the regions are represented by the Bundesrat. So the second or the upper house of the German parliament, but this is actually the regional governments and not the regional parliaments. So the regional parliaments themselves are comparatively weak, whereas in Belgium, for example, the regional parliaments have the strongest power, and they can actually issue reasoned opinions without necessarily the national parliament having to take those on board. So in the Belgian case, it's as soon as one regional parliament issues a reasoned opinion, Belgium will actually cast at least one vote in this early warning mechanism. So there are considerable differences there. There are also considerable differences in the mobilization of regional parliaments, and this is what we can look at here. So in the table on the left, what you can see is how many regional parliaments are actually participating in this RegPacks network to assess subsidiarity. And you can see in percentages that actually in Belgium, it's 80% of the regional parliaments, and this data is from 2016 or 17, I think. And in other countries, like Austria or Britain, it was only 2/3 of the regional parliaments that actually participated in this mechanism. But now when you look at what percentage of regions, of regional parliaments then have actually submitted an actual reasoned opinion as part of the early warning system, you can see that percentage is much lower. So in many countries, it's actually only 1/3 of the regional parliaments that used this mechanism in this 11-year period. And on the right, you can see in this chart again, that for most regional parliaments, there's actually no activity, or for a lot of them, there's no activity. And also that then the levels of activity are really different. So Thuringia and Bavaria in Germany have been very, very active in issuing reasoned opinions, also Baden-Württemberg. But many of the German Länder have not really participated in this mechanism. And also only 3 of the Austrian regions actively participated from the data that I have. And in Britain, it is only, in fact, Wales that participated. And you can see that for Austria and especially for Belgium and the UK, there are actually very, very few reasoned opinions that were adopted. Here you can see the number overall, basically, for these regions. And the third point is that actually over time, fewer and fewer regional parliaments participate actively. So in 2017, only 4 regional parliaments from those 4 countries actually uploaded at least one reasoned opinions, and that's Upper Austria, Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria, and Thuringia. Also, essentially many of these regional parliaments only participated in one single year in that 11-year period. So you can see that for most regional parliaments, the activity is really, really low. And the question is indeed, as some of this is very historic, so they only took part in 2007 or 2010 or 2012. The question is, are these parliaments still actively monitoring European legislation, or have they given up? And lastly, there's also some oddities. For example, for one Commission proposal on maritime spatial planning and integrated coastal management, you actually had reasoned opinions from Bavaria and Thuringia, which, if you know German geography, they don't have a coastline. So this is somewhat surprising that they would issue a reasoned opinion. And actually Thuringia acknowledged the fact that it doesn't even have a coastline. And that raises the question of whether there is some cooperation or division of labor between German regional parliaments. So whether they did this on behalf of other regions, in fact, this somewhat mysterious move. So also with regard to the Committee of the Regions, there are still some questions. Indeed, most of the seats from states or states working by the regions. So this shows that there it's the stronger regions that really do play a role rather than local authorities. However, we could also see that, for example, in the UK, almost all the seats were taken up by local authorities, and indeed Scotland and Northern Ireland refused to, Scotland and Wales, I think it is, deliberately did not send regional level representatives because they felt that the Committee of the Regions did not represent them in terms of their powers. And also in the case of Belgium and Germany, even though there technically the regions are well represented, but I found in my research on regional interest representation that generally those regions tend to emphasize the importance of their regional offices in Brussels and the national coordination mechanisms rather than the Committee of the Regions. Actually, one of the few exceptions is the Austrian region of Vorarlberg, which does really value the Committee of the Regions, but it also does not have a regional office in Brussels. All the other regions, usually the strong legislative regions, downplay the importance of the Committee of the Regions. So I think there is also some question on still whether for these regions, the Committee of the Regions is strong enough from their perspective. So by way as a conclusion and outlook, I would say that clearly the role of regions has been strengthened on the European level in different ways. However, some of these mechanisms do not seem to appear to work that well, especially from the perspective of the stronger regions in Europe, like the early warning system, like the Committee of the Regions. And I think one of the key questions that really remains is the way forward. I think all the regions are united in one Europe that is closer to the regions and closer to the citizens. But I think what is not clear is still how this can be achieved, how regions can be strengthened given the diversity of this context, given the fact that some countries don't have regions or have very, very weak administrative regions. So I think this is one of the challenges that remains. And this is something that will tie into Gabi's paper next, where they look at the future negotiations now and at the way forward. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Annalena Högenauer, for this again very interesting talk, which fits perfectly, I think, to the other presentations we are going to have, as you mentioned in the end. So the next presentation will be by a couple of four colleagues, which is Gabriele Abes, of course, Martin Grosse-Hüttemann, both from University of Tübingen, and my colleagues Sarah Meyer and Simon Lehnhardt from the Danube University Krems from the RegioPAL project. And they prepared a paper for us, which is titled The Committee of Regions and the Conference on the Future of Europe. So, Gabi, you're going to be the presenter? Okay, very nice.
Okay, yes, thank you so much, Elisabeth. And I also want to share my screen because I prepared some slides to take you through our presentation. And as you already said, this is a co-authored paper, and I would like to say thank you, of course, to my three co-authors. It was an interesting experience to do this between the Tübingen and the RegioPAL team here. And so what we do here in focusing on the Committee of the Regions in relation to the now starting conference on the future of Europe, and the paper starts with the observation that the Committee of the Regions has been active over the last, well, bit more 1.5 years almost on this conference on the future of Europe. And so we would like to know what is the role of the Committee of the Regions in the conference, in the development of the conference on the future of Europe. Because starting from what we've seen recently, the joint declaration, there's not really a role for the conference, for the Committee of the Regions, for the COR in that conference, or in the conference governing structure at least. So what we try to do in that paper is to describe and analyze the discussion in the COR itself and its multifaceted activism in relation to the to the conference here. So the structure of the paper is quite simple. We have, of course, a bit of an introductory part here, and then I would skip that in my presentation. Then we have a discussion of the conceptual background, which we think is helpful. I will go a little bit into that. We outline the background of the Conference of Europe since 2019, how it evolved. And then the main part of the chapter of the paper is really looking based on all the documents and the reports which are there. So we look at the position the EU institutions, Commission, Parliament, Council take with regards to the role of regions in the conference and with regards to the involvement of the COR itself in the conference and in the governance structure here. So, and the second part, which we do here, then we look into discussions and positions taken by the Committee of the Regions itself in relation to the conference. And then we have a brief discussion of some of the findings and, of course, very preliminary conclusions, given that the whole process has only recently started. So it's very difficult and impossible to come up with conclusions here. Right. So as for the conceptual approach, the background of the paper is that we do see the development of this light build of the vision of Europe of the regions since the 1990s already. Really, some of that has already been discussed here, and in my more recent work, we spoke more of a Europe with the regions, because I think that makes a difference here if it's of the regions, making them sole actors here, as opposed to Europe with the regions. But we certainly do see quite a lot of activism by regions in the last 20-30 years. Annalena just spoke about some of that. The Committee of the Regions itself, an outcome of all this regional activism and of this talk about Europe of the region, because founded after that Maastricht Treaty in response to all the regional activism. And it's itself a proponent of this light build of the Europe of the regions, of multi-level governance, governance in partnership, as it's often called. So we think that two conceptual approaches are helpful when trying to explain what we can observe in the more recent discussions here. And first of all, it's the idea of institutional activism. And that is, you do see here the Haworth and Roos definition. I'm not going to read that out, but the idea that institutions become active in terms of expanding their powers, expanding their goals. And we can see that the Committee of the Region has also before the Conference of the Future of Europe, but actually since its inception, that it has developed a number of activities on trying to expand its formal role, which is clearly formally quite limited, but also going into a number of more informal activities or extracurricular activities, as it's sometimes called, in trying to find its role, finding its place in the EU polity, and trying to shape this polity. So that's the first idea. And the second conceptual idea is political opportunity structures. This goes back to the work by Sidney Tarrow and what it means that actors, it could be people, but also collective actors, so as institutions, they scan their environment and look for incentives, and at some stages in time, and this Conference on the Future of Europe is such a time slot where incentives come up to use the opportunities provided at this particular point in time, and try to use that in line with the idea of institutional activism to expand powers here. So idea is this is an opportunity structure here, and from this concept we derive that we want to look into how open the political structures of the conference are, and trying to outline how the COR tries to utilize this opportunity structures to follow up on its route of institutional activism. And secondly, we look also to the different allies the committee has here, formal or informal allies, other EU actors who argue in line with the ideas outlined by the Committee of the Region here. Right, then I will not go into the background about the Committee of on the Conference of the Future of Europe, because most of you will know a lot about that it started with von der Leyen's initiative in 2019. And is now going to start formally this month. So what happened in between? It officially started with the Commission communication in January 2020, sorry. And in this communication, we see that the Commission mentions the Committee of the Regions briefly. It mentions the role of regional and local authorities, and it does mention regional parliaments, and they should all be as equal partners contributing to the conference. So there is a role foreseen here for the Committee of the Regions, and there is clearly a perception that regions are important partners for organizing these citizens panels, because that is really at the heart of the Conference on the Future of Europe, that it should not be deliberation among EU institutions or EU formal political institutions at EU level and national level, but it should involve citizens. That is really the innovative new aspect of the conference here. And for this is a topos that we then continuously find regions play a role, because they could be the ones organizing some of that. When we look at the European Parliament resolution of January 2020, We also see that there is a commitment to regional and local level, that it should be a key element here of this process. Yet the role of the Committee of the Regions itself here is quite unclear, but the European Parliament was certainly very much itself an institution, getting into institutional activism, because for the first time it wanted a stronger role for itself in the organization and the conduct of the conference on the future of Europe, and it was actually quite successful in relation to that. And third institution, of course, there is a council position of June last year, where we do see a commitment that the structure, the governance structure of the conference should include COR members. There is the executive body, the executive board, there is a plenary. Those are the two elements here of the governance structure, plus a secretariat. And the council position does speak also about the need for citizen involvement at regional level here. So we see that in all three institutions' positions, regions play a role, yet it's not very clearly defined, and the role of the Committee of the Regions itself, it's mentioned several times. And then I jump to the joint declaration of these three EU institutions, the joint declaration issued in March, where we see, well, yes, there is a role for the COR as an observer in the executive board, and that's the key body here in terms of the governance structure, plus 4 plenary members for the COR, and there is mentioning of regional panels. So let's continue this tour de table through the different papers. Now, what is the position of the Committee of the Region itself about its role? What we can clearly see that the Committee of the Region, the COR, has been very active. December 2019, from the start, it looked into what's coming up here. So it has discussed this conference several times, especially the Civics Commission, which is the commission in within the COR, which is in charge of that. That's the Commission for Citizenship, Governance, Institutions and External Affairs. So, and they have continuously discussed that, and since December 2019, at each Civics Commission meeting, they have discussed different aspects related to the conference here. When we look at the positions in the various documents, it's clearly emphasized that this that the conference provides an opportunity that the COR must seize, that it must take account of, that it must get involved into it. And the official COR resolution adopted in February last year, there are a number of important points. I would just like to mention these 4 most important aspects here. Well, it does stress that there is a need for regional and local representatives to enhance the visibility of the conference. So arguing for a strong link here between the European and the regional level. The COR says that it will offer support for regional and local activities related to the conference. So this is very much in line with the role of the COR as a facilitator. It does mention that there is a need for a bottom-up debate equipped with deliberative tools. The COR does have some experience with that, and it discusses the role of regional and local democracy and self-government, that this is something, a topic which should be at the heart of the conference. And it calls for having full participation rights for at least 8 COR members. Remember, the joint declaration I just mentioned, it's now 4 COR members. What is also striking that in addition to that, the COR has established a high-level group on democracy, chaired by Herman van Rompuy, the former president of the European Council. And this group consists of 7 wise men and women, and its mandate is to support the Committee of the Regions' activities in relation to the conference, strengthen the impact and influence of subnational local authorities in European decision making, and also to stimulate a discussion on European democracy. This group is to work together with COR representatives. And then another initiative which will be launched in the next couple of days also is to, with a group of stronger regions, Wolfgang Peters called them the Champions League of regions, to engage and help them set up citizens panels, to get into training, develop experiences, maybe even role models. So in total, it's clear that the Committee of the Region calls for a stronger role for itself in the conference here, and it very much acts as a facilitator, helping regions to become active. What kind of conclusions do we draw from these very preliminary findings? Of course, still tentative here. But I think in line with our conceptual approach, we do see that this is clearly perceived here as an opportunity structure, that we can find the COR institutional activism call for stronger involvement, even if they have achieved less in the now upset of the governance structure than what was originally called for by the COR itself. So we do see that the COR here works as a partner for the regions and as a facilitator for regional activism, that this is very much in line with the COR identity as it has developed. 2 things we found interesting, we get 2 metaphors which come up, is that COR does mention that at the local and regional level there is 1 million representatives, so that the number of local regional representatives called leaders even outnumbers the number of European leaders in EU institutions. So they bring in this argument, we represent much more leaders here than other EU institutions, and there is a topos of the House of European Democracy, which needs to be strengthened by strengthening also the foundations, and the regions are certainly part of that. In line with that, the Committee of the Region will support regional citizens panels, and it, as I said, it does have also experiences with this initiative Reflecting on Europe campaign. But the final point is that in the COR resolution, for example, we find no concrete proposals for treaty change in favor of regions or the COR itself. And there we see that this is a difference to the previous experience that we have with the COR in treaty changes and constitutional discussions here. So thank you. I stop here, and yes, I look forward to your comments then on this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabi. We are a bit over time, but not too much, I think. That's quite okay. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is going to be Marie Cabret. She is delegate of the Catalan regional government in Germany, and she is going to introduce the topic of regions for EU recovery, design thinking and sustainable leadership strategies in European regions initiative to us. Marie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope the internet connection will be stable enough. In case you have different difficulties with my my speech, just give me a sign and then I'll switch off the video in order to have more broadband. So I would like to share my short presentation on the initiative for Regions for EU Recovery. And I participate today as a practitioner and as a researcher. So not everything what I'm saying is thought beforehand, but it's something that I have discovered during my analysis, which is the role of design thinking and sustainable leadership in today's regional politics. And the topic of strengthening the house of the EU democracy that Gabriele Aves just mentioned comes in very handy, because we are all talking about all these topics just because we want to strengthen the democracy in the EU and the somehow lost connection of the EU to its citizens. And here is where, as I understand, the regions play an important role, because in an organization, they are subunits that can create replicator dynamics with the citizens, as they are really close to the citizens. So we have seen the Euro crisis in the years 2008 and following. And as Uncha Rickman says, during the time of trying to manage these very thorough crises, the EU has lost contact to its citizens, and democratic accountability has become difficult. So if we consider the pandemic a new crisis, I think we shouldn't apply the same recipes as we did in the last crisis, because it's very likely that we're going to fail in the same places where we have failed in the former crisis. So let's think about new ways or new approaches of doing politics, and how can this can be done. So I have an art school and arts and design school background, and I was really surprised when I discovered that there was something new called design thinking and business, because I always have thought that it was like you try to find which needs need to be met, and but design thinking is something relatively new. It's been taken over by the D School at the Hasso-Plattner Institute at Stanford, and there is a D School in Potsdam as well in Germany. So design thinking is a strategy on how to solve problems. And I think it's interesting to analyze it in connection with our topic today, because stakeholders play a very important role in the design thinking process. So, sorry. Design thinking comes from the business world. So if you remember, at some point when computers started to be at each household, the mouse was invented and sold, because people found out that it's not very handy to navigate through the computer just by the cursors on the keyboard. So a group that's called IDEO created the mouse and other devices that made working with computer easier. And these people then started this school at Stanford, and their methodology are now applied to many, many design processes. But Professor Litka has created a methodology to apply design thinking in social processes, which is also a method that I have 5 minutes to explain what it is, because I want to talk about the 3 topics about design thinking, sustainable leadership, and the EU Regents Recovery Initiative. So I've just 5 minutes. Yeah, was that a sign? My internet connection stable or? So design thinking. I think the revolutionary part of design thinking is that when in former times innovation processes departed from an expert group that did top-down development of ideas, nowadays and through design thinking, we get stakeholders into the innovation process right from the beginning. So that changes the whole conversation, and we have a top-down innovation process that we had before, turns processes into an organic process, which is very important. And this is important also for politics, because top-down times are gone. I think we can't rely on politics as a top-down decision-taking process. And here is where design thinking can innovate, can help to get on board the citizens and the regions. So this was a very short overview on what design thinking is. I now want to jump to sustainable leadership. So sustainable leadership might sound a little alternative or not very businessy, but actually big business transnational enterprises have adopted the sustainable leadership approaches in their leadership strategies, because sustainability is considered a mega trend. So you can't, it's imperative, you can't avoid sustainability. We need our world and our business world to be sustainable. And the same thing happens to be applied to the politics. So we need politics to be sustainable. So what does it mean? Sustainable leadership is durable in time and sustainable, as the name says. And in contrast, to authoritarian leadership, for example, and quick decision making. But sustainable leadership is what continues and to live possible. So we want to live in a different democratic organization or in a democratic environment. Sustainable leadership takes into account different voices and not just voice of the leader. 6C model of sustainable leadership, and I don't want to explain one per one, but what I think is important that we get out of it, that there's a strong aspect of empathy. Empathy is a very strong driver of sustainable leadership. So ideas and solutions are found via empathy with other stakeholders or participants of an organization. What you see here on the table is you have the sustainable leadership elements on the left, which are the 6C according to Tiedemann, and the concepts used in economics and business until now. So just to get a quick overview on which type of correlation there is to other concepts. I think for regional politics, the connectedness, the context, and the collectiveness are the 3 main points, or the strongest points that are already done in regional politics, because regional politics are really connected to the vote and voters execute a strong accountability over the regional politics. So there is already this strong connection to the stakeholders. So once explained these two types of leadership and ideal finding, I want to outline what is the Regions for EU Recovery initiative that started in 2020 and is still going on. Maybe there are other people in the audience that are connected to regional politics, but you might remember that the Corona crisis put the regional governments in a difficult situation of managing a pandemic without really having the infrastructure for it. So we all remember these images of exhausted sanitary workers, overcrowded hospitals, and so on, all these very sad things, which really had an impact on regional politics. And the big question was, what can we do? So what do we need to do? So when the Catalan Minister for External Relations and Transparency started in office, took over office in March 2020, he did a first phone call to his colleagues around Europe, other regional ministers. And a common claim or common question was, how do you manage the crisis? So out of this moment of empathy, Mr. Bernat Soler, which is the Minister of External Affairs and Transparency in Catalonia, decided that some action needed to be taken. And an initiative was planned amongst 24 regions to address President von der Leyen and say, we are concerned that now we are handling all the crisis without the resources, and in the moment when the states have the opportunity, they will access all the fundings on the funds, the European Recovery Fund, and we will stay aside and this another time once again outside of the game. So a joint letter to the EC president was written, initially signed by 24 regions. By now 31 regions that signed the letter. Just before Christmas, this was on December 3rd, on 21st of December, the President Ursula von der Leyen replied the group via letter. The committees of regions President Apostolos Tzitzikostas also replied the letter. On February 4th, Commissioner Elisa Ferreira answered also the letter, and in March there was a reply of the head of the cabinet of the President of the European Council, Frédéric Bernard, also. All in the sense of what a good initiative, go on, and states will be held accountable on how they spend the recovery funds, on what role the regions have in the economic recovery. So just to give an overview how it's going on, the first results are that there is a close dialogue between members of the initiative and the committee of regions. There has been a first joint event in Brussels organized by Bavaria. And there are right now 3 working groups, organization of at least 3 more online events. A task force has been created that focuses on quick interchanging of experience and best practices in economic recovery. And a 3rd group is developing a joint contribution from all of this group to the future of the EU conference. Here is a overview of on all the signing regions. There are several other regions that are like on the doorstep. They didn't sign until now, but they are going to sign, and it's still open. So any region that's interested in signing is still very welcome to sign the initiative. This initiative is not an organized, stable, official organization. The idea is that it's a task force. It's quick. It's just because the challenges are so big, and the moment the pandemic is over, this initiative will disappear as well. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Marie. You've perfectly stick to time. So we have had the 4 presentations, and I would like to ask our discussants to take the floor. I'm not sure whether you've agreed on who is going to be first, because it says in my notes that Francesco Palermo is going to discuss the first and the last paper, and Wolfgang Peters the 2 in the middle. So is there anybody who wants to begin? So then I will hand over the floor to Francesco Palermo. Is that okay? Perfect.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
About 10 minutes or something like that.
Yes, perhaps less. Thank you so much, and thanks for this highly interesting conference, and for the challenging pleasure you've given me to discuss these excellent papers. Not so easy to find a common thread here, but I think in fact, as the chairperson mentioned, two papers look more at what happened and 2 more in the new perspectives, and I shall deal mostly with the latter ones, so Caravita and Caprez. It seems to me in any case that quite clearly from all the papers there is an underlying question that emerges. The question is basically what has left of what Hug in the 1990s called the subnational mobilization movement, right? So we see 20 years down the road that the situation of the regional participation in the EU decision-making process and architecture more general has deeply changed, and we are now searching for a new role of that. So my impression based on the papers, and here I mention all 4 of them, is that a number of turning points have made the life of regions as key actors of the European governance far more difficult as compared to 20 years ago, right? Maybe the first of such turning points was 9/11, which was not mentioned by any presentation, but quite clearly it has changed something, but many others have also followed, such as in particular, I would say the failure of the Constitutional Treaty. Then the Treaty of Lisbon, which has overall strengthened the role of the Council, as pointed out by Beniamino Caravita. Hugenauer did not take a stand on this, right? So, but I tend to agree with Professor Caravita that actually the new architecture introduced in Lisbon has strengthened the Council rather than the regions overall. But then there were the economic crisis, the migration crisis, and of course the current pandemic. And these are all issues that have directly or indirectly limited the role of regional actors in the construction, in the architecture, in the kaleidoscope of the European governance, or at least they have changed and reshaped the role of the regions. Overall, what seems to emerge is quite of a scary picture, because the constantly growing role of the states in the past 2 decades has correspondingly diminished the role of the regions, or at least have forced the regions to look at different ways to make their voice heard in the EU decision-making process. Now, as it has been recalled, a new window is opening with the Conference on the Future of Europe. And this obviously raises many expectations, but there seems to be also, I don't know whether this is really a more awareness of the regional variable in preparing the work of the Conference for the Future of Europe, or this is more of a wishful thinking, I don't know. Or maybe we, so pro-integration, tend to see that this is a really new opportunity. This is also possibly due to the role of the Committee of the Regions. Well, maybe as we have the expert here, Mr. Petzold, he will tell more. But I'm coming to the main point. I'm not sure that the communication by the Commission, especially on the Conference of on the Future of Europe from January, which has been extensively quoted by Abels, Grosse, Hüttmann, and Meyer, leaves much room for hope. Because this communication mentions that the conference will be open to civil society. This comes in first place. The European institutions, other European bodies, the national, regional, and local authorities, parliaments, and other stakeholders. And then in a second stage, there is also a special mention of national and regional parliaments as representative bodies. But the fact that all goes in the same pot, from local authorities to civil societies, parliaments, etc., raises some questions in my view. And again, the paper by Abels and others show that a similar approach is also followed by the Council and by the Parliament. And in my view, it is of course understandable that the focus on the upcoming conference on the future of Europe is on, I would say, communicating Europe to the citizens, right? Considering especially that there were severe communication mistakes at the time of the Constitutional Treaty. But maybe here again, it would be helpful to listen to Mr. Petzold. My feeling is that this attempt to communicate Europe stressing too much the democratic element gives a misleading picture of the regional dimension. So are regions or subnational actors more general the same as civil society? Or are we just exaggerating here a bit in order to try to find a democratic legitimacy to the whole process? I'm not saying that this is not important, actually, the contrary, but I only wonder whether, so to paraphrase the famous Böckenförde dilemma, whether the EU relies on prerequisites which it cannot guarantee itself. And this, in this case, the unrealizable premise would be that the EU is evolving into something like a state, which needs, of course, a type of democratic legitimacy which is different to the one of a international organization. So this new stage that the conference will open can be seen, of course, positively, and all the papers have at least partly a positive or optimistic tone, which is very encouraging. I'm happy to hear that. Abels and others are positive in why, because they argued that regional authorities can be key in organizing the participation of the citizens. Caravita suggests that it is about revisiting the concept of Europe, of the regions, with the regions, what have you, which has to take a new shape, including by changing the role of the Committee of the Regions, accepting that the states remain the masters of the whole process. But this does not mean, in his view, if I got you right, that the idea is over. And Capretz mentioned the potential of horizontal cooperation among regions and territories. And Högenauer has shown that in the end, the role of the regions, according to the treaties, still remains significant. So I think there are also good reasons to be optimistic. But at the same time, the point of departure of this upcoming conference can also be seen more pessimistically, and would tend to do so also for the sake of discussion, because the institutional dimension of the regional level is important, and it seems that it goes neglected. I'm coming mostly from the federal studies, and I have argued that federal studies are the matrix for the study of participation, because federalism has been the first structural institutional instrument to deal with pluralism, and participation is simply a more sophisticated form of pluralism. So I see the importance of participation in this new process, but would caution against missing the institutional dimension of the subnational government. Let me conclude in a slightly provocative term, just in order to raise some debate on this. In general, I wonder whether in the political and academic discourse, and also in the preparatory documents of the conference on the future of Europe, there is too much emphasis on the democratic aspect, which brings down everything to the democratic discourse, strengthening the role of parliament, reaching out to civil society, which is all good, of course, but it neglects the multi-level or multi-tier element of such a construction. This should at least be considered, because in a balanced institutional structure, not everything is democratic, nor democracy is everything, I would say. Federalism is typically the synthesis of a democratic and a territorial element. And if there is too much of an imbalance, then the effectiveness decreases. So think, for example, of the evolution or involution of the role of the second chambers in federal systems. So the issue is the role of the regions in this broader question. And my feeling is that this is not sufficiently debated, and that there is a mainstreamed acceptance of the fact that only democratic legitimacy is relevant. And the search for a democratic image of the EU and the obsession with the democratic deficit has been perhaps the main reason behind the constitutional treaty project, and maybe one of the main reasons why it failed, because it created a counter movement in the states and in the populations, which pushed the new statism that we are witnessing at the moment. So this approach is visible in the position of the Commission, but also in the draft declaration of the Committee of the Regions. Several proposals will be made to this conference, and perhaps this will change. But I just want to caution against, the perspective of a quasi-state structure in which the regions would be kind of one of the actors of participation, and not actors, institutional actors next to states, and more separate from the civil society and possibly also from the local level. So I just want to rate it up. I have no clear-cut answer, but I just believe that the question is a bit underestimated. So I hope this can contribute to the discussion. And thanks again for the excellent papers.
Thank you very much, Francesco Palermo. Before we go ahead with Wolfgang Peters, I would like to encourage the audience to already post questions in the chat if you have some, so that we can carry on with the discussion immediately after our two discussants. So feel free to already think about questions, post some questions, and so on. But next discussant is going to be Wolfgang Peters. Please.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Donat, and thanks for having me. I would like to ask the technical moderator to allow me to show just one slide in the second part of my comments. And I'm quite grateful for all the papers and also grateful for the comments I was just listening to from Professor Palermo. I mean, it's not that often that researchers look into the Committee of the Regions or in the regional question in such depth and richness. So you can imagine that me, myself, but also my colleagues here on the call from the committee love this kind of stuff. Let me summarize my thoughts in 3 or 4 points. And I wrote down a sentence when listening to the presentations, and I read it out to you because it might summarize a little bit of the melancholia, the regional melancholia one might have when looking into history, but also looking into the future. Maybe the regions and their committee, if I may say so, in Brussels, are just too important to fail or to disappear. But on the other side, they are too much sidelined to be influential. And that is something that is to be kept in mind when one looks to all the empirical data, and grateful for Professor Hugenauer's paper on the early warning mechanism or system, and also on the very in-depth insight into the Conference on the Future of Europe and the role of regions by Professor Abels and her colleagues. So if this being too important to fail and being too much sidelined to be important is maybe a dividing line between the policies and the politics that make up the role of regions and the role of the committee in EU politics. And again, if you look at the policies on the one side and the bigger picture, the institutional settings and what the future might hold for regions in the EU, you might find not a completely holistic argument about both. I make one case on the policies, and here I also reach out to what Marie Capretz has outlined in the response of regions to the current crisis. When you look into what happened with the EU budget and the Next Generation Europe funding, you can read the story in 2 ways. You can say on the one side, big progress for European integration, because for the first time, the EU went going to financial markets and is kind of communitarizing debts, which was for a long time refused by some member states, and you know them all. On the other side, when you look into the details of delivery of this really big budget, there has never been something bigger than that before, you see a very blurred picture. The whole cohesion policy has been divided up in many more funds than there were before. There's a Just Transition Fund now, there's a REACT EU fund, and so on and so on. And then there's a big chunk, the really important chunk, for which regions don't really have a say. We were discussing this in our plenary this week, by the way, and we were making the case in front of the Prime Minister of Portugal, so the current president of the EU presidency of the Council, and saying that there's not enough regional voice in this. You can have big projects, you know, of course, the member states are happy to take the money and run and put the money most of the time in already existing projects. But if you don't listen to the regional voices, if you don't even listen to the people in certain neighborhoods, if you don't take them on board, you can easily get big projects where that are not needed in the long term. So there's a risk here, and that's more linked to regional policy and its history. And one could say, okay, damn it, it goes back to a nationalization of regional policies, or even a Europeanization within these recovery and resilience funding. And I'd say that's a real risk. So this about policies and about politics. Yes, of course. If you think about the future of the institutions, you might think about, which is now in some party programs, we have elections in Germany, and the Greens, but also the Liberals, have voted in their party programs for a federal republic. How would that look like? A federal republic of Europe, without the regions or with the regions? Big question mark. A second chamber, a senate, or whatever. So these things completely right. They are not discussed in the committee, but believe that we have drawers in which we have such concepts. And there have been earlier presidents or previous presidents of the Committee of the Regions who have, for example, made the case for a Senate of Regions. Whether that's a good or a bad idea to be seen, but definitely what can't continue is the institutional setting as it currently stands. Now, a little bit about Professor Högenauer's paper. I love the story you found out about the maritime, the statements on maritime regions from two German länder who don't have a coastline. Thank you very much for that. You made my day, because it shows that indeed the activism, the institutional activism is not only reserved for the Committee of the Regions, but it also happens at regional local levels. I've dived into this in parallel, and there are only two remarks that I would like to make. The first remark is the task force on subsidiarity and proportionality, which the Parliament deliberately chose not to take part in, but there was a high influence of the Committee of the Regions over the process in 17 and 18, has given birth to a concept of active subsidiarity. I would like to invite you to investigate into this. I'm not saying that I'm convinced of it. A colleague of mine is on the call, so I don't say anything negative on this. But I think it might turn out that there is some room to investigate a little bit further. What the committee made out of it is that we established a network, it's called RegHub of Regions, who look into the application of EU law at local level. So you might also classify this under institutional activism. But nevertheless, we have been given a role in the current refit platform, and this is something that we would count as a success story that came out of this. The unsuccess story was indeed that it was only the task force that worked for a couple of months under Juncker still, had 3 representatives from national parliaments, from the Commission, and from the Committee of the Regions, and as I said, no one from the Parliament. So the Parliament, does not take this serious at all. The other thing, that's something I'm not so sure about. When you show the graphs and you say there's a tendency that the active regions or the activism of regions goes down, that they're not so interested in these subsidiarity network, it might be a pointer to the success of things, because if laws that are proposed take subsidiarity, and you know perfectly well that this is taken into account while the proposals are made, are more and more respecting the subnational level, it might be that things are in order. So the whole story might be even read as a success story, not as a story of non-interest. And now I would like to show, if I may, something on the conference on the future of Europe. Let me check whether I can open that. Yep. I want to show this and share this with you because Ms. Abel said that, we are not so important as we would like to be. Now, this conference, first of all, it's not a convention. Everybody knows this, I think, on the call. And there can be, our president asked for the exact number of members from the committee that is now in the plenary session on the left side, where you have 108 each from the European and the national parliament. So that's behind the 273. Our president asked in a letter to the executive board, where he is an observer, as a member, to put the exact number of local and regional politicians or members of the committee into that plenary session. This is, of course, not possible, so it will not happen. But however, we might get more than the 4 members that Gabriele Abels was mentioning. The last figures we heard were 20 members of the committee or local politicians in that plenary session. Now, the problem with the plenary session, which is the decisive body of making a report, and maybe that report that leads further on to a convention. The problem there is that Article 48 of the treaty rules, meaning you cannot have members who make, for example, decisions on the future of Europe that would not be members of the Commission. At least that's the thinking in the three institutions that rock the boat here. So the Convention defines that it is national parliament members, European Parliament members, and Council and Commission people, and not anybody from the regional level. That's a given. That's a given. And so I would understand if someone from the Parliament says, "Listen, if we vote in the plenary session on the recommendations to the EU and to the three EU institutions on the future of Europe, the voting powers cannot be with people, say, from an NGO or an advisory body or to the European Union. We have to keep kind of democratic or institutional control of this." You can read it otherwise, but this is what I'm referring to is, let's say, an institutional viewpoint that is at least understandable. The big innovation, that's why I want to show the picture, is not so much whether or not there are regions this time around. The big innovation is on the right side. To ask citizens, like Macron has done in 2017-18, and not only to ask them, not only to listen to them, but also to take their recommendations to a higher level, or to make them even, if you want, government politics. So open box, I close this presentation again, and I think it's interesting to be observed. Last proof of our institutional activism, and then I stop. While I was listening to you guys, it's happening that the 9th of May celebrations are prepared. So what will happen on the 9th of May? Frankly, no one knows, because the only thing that's sure is Macron will be there. So that makes it, of course, a big event. Maybe even Zas, the French singer, will be there. It makes it even a bigger event. And what did the Committee of the Regions do? Because we were not invited to the big table, we opened our own table. So while the conference will be opened by von der Leyen, Sassoli, Costa, and Macron, we have 2 hours before that, not in the parliament in Strasbourg, but in the town hall, a meeting, a lineup, might find it boring, of 20 local politicians from France and, of course, our president. And we also invite Vice President Suica, Guy Verhofstadt, and Antonio Costa. So this is, again, you know, a sign that the conference happens, they don't invite us, but we do something on top of that, because yes, there's 1 million people behind us who are voted upon, and who are kind of responsible for their constituencies by applying permanently European legislation. So that's the argument that we will continue to use, whether it helps or whether we will be driven by institutional activism or events, that is to be seen. And these events, and then I close, really can be quite soon. Today, you know, there is voting time in a couple of regions in the still United Kingdom. And it might turn out that one of these regions in the United Kingdom, or nations in the United Kingdom, might want to become a member state. So let's see what kind of dynamism this might lead to. I'm not convinced that the story of the regions is over. I'm just convinced that it's very hard to predict what will happen next. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. So finally we made it, and we have some, I would say, 20 minutes left for discussion. So I would like to encourage once again the audience to think about their questions, since we have to really structure this discussion to be effective. And I've seen that there are no questions in the chat up to now. You may also like to raise your hand virtually with this emoticon you have.
There's one now.
There is one now, of course. I'm just wondering also whether the presentators would like to react to the discussants. So please give me a sign if you like to do so. Some of them have been addressed directly, like Annalena Hügenauer. So if you like to react to the discussants' comments, please give me a sign. Otherwise, I would like to continue with the first question. Perfectly, Serafin has already made himself visible. Please go ahead.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Serafin Pathos. I both a practitioner and a researcher, and I used to be for many years secretary of the 4 members of the Committee of the Regions. Also take the chance to actually meet in person a lot of the scholars that I read and recite over the years. So it's good to see many of you in sort of presence. People like me and Wolfgang and others were part of the European Convention on the Future of Europe. That was 20 years ago this year. And looking at the Conference on the Future of Europe, I cannot avoid by thinking that it is exactly the same as regards to regions, other than a lot of things have changed, and including the issue about citizen participation, less elitist. I said in some other paper I wrote on this, that is like the convention of 20 years ago with the smartphones and social networks. So it's a much more participation. But for regards for regions, isn't it true that because of the paradigm has changed so much, that it is certainly quite pessimistic about the institutional advances that regions will be able to achieve in the convention, because perhaps the high point was the subsidiarity task force in the communication of 2018 and everything that came out of the better regulation and so on. There is, I think, this week RegLec-BIS network set up after 20 years, and it's actually many more less regions than originally was the case. So that suggests that there is also not treaty fatigue, but action fatigue of the regions to concern themselves on that. So the question is like, do you think, in general, to all the speakers, you think that we had already reached in 2018 the high point, and it's about maximizing the opportunities that are provided there, reg habit, regulation, and so on, than expecting significant changes in the institutional setting of the regions out of the Convention of Future of Europe? Thank you.
Thank you very much. All speakers have been addressed. Is there anybody who likes to answer? Gabi?
Elisabeth, maybe we can collect some questions.
Of course.
Yeah.
So there is another question from Johannes von Dorvien. Do you want to unmute yourself? Otherwise, I can read it out. So a question in the chat, the next one is, how can it be, or is it ensured institutionally that the proposal of the European Citizens Forum are actually find their way into policy making? Wolfgang raised his hand. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, we are going to address these two. Okay, so I think we can go ahead with these two questions from Serafin and from Johannes. Who likes to start? Annalena?
Yes, well, as I also had some comments from the discussants, I think it might make sense that I start. I have to admit, so unfortunately, I can't address the question about the European Citizens Forum from the audience. It's not my area of expertise, so I'll have to delegate this one. But so to respond to the discussants, I think it's a good point that was made by Francesco Palermo, that indeed the Lisbon Treaty has strengthened the Council. And even more than the Lisbon Treaty, I think the crises have strengthened the Council, and especially the European Council. And in the Council, at least the stronger regions are potentially represented where their powers are affected depending on the arrangements in their member states, but or at least through their national coordination mechanisms. But especially I think the European Council is a challenge, because I don't think that regions are particularly well represented on that level, even if we take into account that there are also domestic coordination mechanisms within the states. I think that's one area where we really have a centralization process that has been noted by a lot of commentators on EU politics. But I think, yes, so I think indeed that so there is the regions are a bit struggling to gain more powers in practice at the moment, and that there is a sort of stagnation in the expansion of regional influence on the European level in the last couple of years. I think also related to something that Francesco Palermo said, one thing we need to take into account, and that's, I think, also a bit related to Wolfgang Peters's comments, is also citizens' preferences on who should deal with policies. And I think that's something that we haven't mentioned yet. But of course, citizens also have preferences on whether they want policies to be centralized or decentralized. And we see, for example, that there's a huge amount of support for European policymaking in the area of climate change when people are asked about that. And I think another example where people, for example, want centralization, I think, is crisis management when it comes to pandemics. And I think the German example illustrates very nicely that we Germans do not believe in federalism when it comes to pandemics. Not after a year of federalism in that area, because it creates chaos and unclarity when it comes to rules. So I think this is also something that needs to be taken into account. So which kind of projects, what policymaking should be done at the local level. And indeed, I think one area that is important is the implementation dimension and transposition dimension, where regions can play a very important role. And I think this is where the Commission and its comitology play a big role, and ensuring that regions are well represented there in providing feedback on how policies function, what kind of policies malfunction when they're actually being implemented. So where do we need improvements? I think this feedback loop is one of the areas where feedback from the regions is really, really essential.
Thank you very much. I think Wolfgang gave me a sign that he can give some answers on the question in the chat.
Yeah, the answer to the question in the chat from Johannes is that the answer is still to be found. It belongs to the uniqueness of the European Union, and especially this process, that it is so open and also a bit chaotic. So for the time being, there is no clear rule set how the citizens' proposals, recommendations, and here I'm talking about, if you remember the graph, of the recommendations made by the European Citizens Panel, which is something to be constructed of 200 citizens that will be selected by lot randomly, so that they are representative for the European citizenship as a whole. And these people will meet 4 times comes autumn. They will discuss over weekends, like they did in the French Convention or in the Irish Citizens Assembly, on 4+1 topic. The +1 topic is an open one. The others are the usual suspects, like climate change, what have you. And then they will vote on recommendations, like the French did and like the Irish did. And these recommendations will travel into the other structure, the plenary, composed, I'd say, mainly of elected members of European and national parliaments. And then they come forward with a report. So the question here, how much these recommendations of the citizens are binding or not, is open. And now imagine this, what we did as a committee, again, back to institutional activism, I said there could be a Champions League of regions who do that, including Baden-Württemberg, the region where the university organizing this is located. And it is like since 10 or 20 years, from different reasons, or for different reasons, that regions have practiced in a much more constitutionalized way. The top example is the region of Ostbelgien, where they have included this in their law, that each time the citizens come forward with a proposal, they have to discuss this in the parliament of the German-speaking community of Belgium. So this is an example, by the way, that made it into the New York Times, and it is kind of globally discussed. 50,000 people, one region in Europe, and they have kind of understood how to listen to citizens in a meaningful way. Whether this will be the way in which this European spaceship of conference on the future of Europe will function, rather doubtful. But at least the element of citizens is there. And again, it's a learning process. We have argued, and this is one of our most important impacts as I see it, after the first process with the citizens' dialogues in 2018, the committee has argued that there should be a permanent citizens' assembly advising on EU policies. And the parliament, in its resolution of January 2020 on the conference, has picked this up. So ideas about a higher degree of citizens' participation travel, in this case, from the committee to the parliament, and they travel into the conference. What the outcome will be, whether there will be a citizens' assembly, a permanent one, before the elections, to be seen. For that, by the way, one would not have to change the treaties, because Article 11 foresees such a participation, not the exact wording of it, but there is at least a possibility by which that could be used to implement such a permanent citizens' assembly. So on Sunday, I just learned between 9 and 12, Guy Verhofstadt will meet his counterparts in the executive board, and they have to discuss exactly how they can make, you know, these ideas and the report happen, because they cannot agree on it since a couple of weeks now. And it's, of course, a power game mainly between Parliament and Council. The Council obviously wishing that there's more control by the executive board on the outcome of this, whereas the Parliament is more in favor of listening closer to the plenary and to the citizens. So that's the conflict line.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. Marita Pritz raised her hand, and Sabine Riedel posed a question in the chat in order to collect things. I'm perhaps first going to read out Sabine's question, and then Marie can carry on. Sabine Riedel encouraged Wolfgang Peters to give some examples about participation, I think. And Marie wanted to add some thoughts.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not capable to answer Serafit Passos, but in the line of what to do with all the beautiful ideas coming up, and maybe not so beautiful, but I'm sure there's a broad bag of ideas coming out or going to come out from this conference. And in the line of what Sabine Riedel asked, is maybe it would be like just to make clear what an idea finding process is about in terms of innovation leadership, because people might think that, okay, great, down there we're going to have like 500 ideas and we're going to implement 500 ideas. I'm not familiar with the internal processes of the EU and how everything is planned, which I'm sure it's perfectly planned. And but normally an innovation leadership process is to give the opportunity of idea finding, to open up the table, to do brainstorming where everything is allowed, then close again, find what is possible, what is realistic, then open up again to find whether these ideas which have like passed like a first state of criteria finding and discarding the worst ideas and so on, opening up again and then closing again and so on until getting to the implementation process. So it's a long process normally, and it's not like now we have like 500 ideas and we're going to implement it. I'm not sure whether the EU is following these steps, but this is how it's normally done. And that was my what I wanted to add.
Thank you very much. Since there are no new questions in the chat, Wolfgang has been addressed once again directly.
Yeah, thanks, Sabine Riedel, for the question. I'm posting something that might be interesting. We compiled a book 2 years ago, and that's the only answer I would have. So the examples come from local levels like Ostbelgien, Baden-Württemberg, Catalonia, Ireland, okay, that's a member state, and others. And it's happening in cities, it's happening in regions, it's happening in macro regions and cross-border regions. It's happening, and it's happening in the many ways that these regions have chosen. The OECD came out with a report, on a global report on citizens' deliberation, and you find lots of examples there, and also some quality criteria that they have developed at the OECD, where they have a network of experts in citizens' deliberation and participation. I put these 2 links into the chat, and you might want to copy it. Maybe that's all I can say. So the argument being from the committee of the region, that's the idea of the Champions League, that when you do something at European level, you should also look at the local and regional levels because it's happening there. So governments, parliaments, they are experimenting with regional participation, and maybe it's good to link this. So the idea of this Champion League, if you want to follow it, we have an event, little advertising block, next Wednesday, together with the German Bertelsmann Foundation, who will guide, I think, maybe 10 to 15 regions. Some have volunteered already, including Catalonia, including Baden-Württemberg, at informal levels. And we might have this process in parallel of 10, 15 regions and feed their ideas, their findings, their practice, their experiments into the conference process as an example of how governments and governance can be based on more citizens' involvement. I post the links now, just a second.
So thank you very much. I think we are quite close to the end, and the last question perfectly fits to some kind of wrap up, I think. So this is a question on an evaluation to this process, and I would like to hand over to Gabriele Abels, perhaps, to give us a short wrap-up of her impressions of this first session and to introduce the next points in the program to us.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Elisabeth, and thank you, of course, to all presenters and for the discussion. And I very much liked your comment, Francesco, that you have the impression too much emphasis on the democratic element and learn more from federal studies, bringing in the more territorial element and consider that with regards to what it would mean having this multi-level structure development. But I don't think that this is really conflicting that much. My assessment differs here from you, because I would think that what we see in the moment, and because it's so dynamic, and that's why it's fascinating to follow up on what's happening, it's not yet really clear what's going to happen. And with regards to the role of regions in the process, and even more so linking that to some of the things been said on the crisis, economic crisis, due to the pandemic and all the effects. It will be certainly very interesting to see what kind of territorial reform discussions we will see as an outcome of the pandemic. So we might see some of that in Germany, because as Annalena pointed out, there's been quite some, dissatisfaction with the very different regulations we had for a while in the German Länder, and now a more centralization of the development of how the pandemic is managed. So and we see that also in a number of other countries. So I would say territorial politics, certainly not a settled issue. So we will see a lot more of that, and we have to deal with that in the EU context. With regards to and certainly with regards to the conference on the future of Europe, I would, as Wolfgang emphasized, as an insider, the rules are not yet clear. There is still a lot of discussions about the rules of procedure for the conference, and we will see some of that tomorrow in session 2, when we have some people also from German Landtag being involved, that like some of the regions want to have a seat here in the plenary and all that. It's still very much an open game. So just very briefly on the subsidiarity task force, that was an interesting interesting story here, but I would still say, well, active subsidiarity being a key outcome, I'm not really convinced that the term active subsidiarity is much clearer than the term subsidiarity without the adjective here of active. So I still think that's still an open discussion here. What is part of subsidiarities and how to define that in various contexts? And again, crisis is part of that. So we're just at the beginning of discussion on many issues here, and that's for academics, of course, very interesting to follow. And I hope that many of you will be here tomorrow again when we continue the discussion with session 2 at 9:30 tomorrow morning, which will look into how regions and the parliament shape the EU. Because when we discussed a lot of things about regions today, it's always a question: is it parliaments? Is it governments? That is an issue. So thank you very much, and I hope to see many of you tomorrow again. But don't log out. For those of you who are interested, we will have a virtual coffee break now, and those of you who are interested in getting to know more about this art project, the Outer Space Transmitter, which is an interesting project. I can only invite you to look into that. The ones who are interested, then just stay online, because Sarah Kikic and Mona Schulzek will take over now, do a presentation and discuss with you what the Outer Space Transmitter is. Those of you who are not interested in that can take a break, log out for the rest of the day. At 5:30, we will have a plenary discussion in German on Europa von unten bauen, about role of the regions here and their role here. But the official conference will continue then tomorrow morning at 9:30 with our second session. But I think we had a quite interesting start into a 2-day conference, and I'm very happy about that. So thank you very much, and yes, I'll definitely see you tomorrow morning, then those of you who will stay with us. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good evening.